Officer James, Melvin sighed. His expression looked slightly exasperated and fond. You are really... Carter whipped his head over, his eyes glaring at Melvin like knives. He had already steeled himself to pretend not to know anything if Melvin persisted on asking to the end of it. Melvin leaned over, pressing their shoulders together. He tilted his head, and next to Carter's ear, lightly uttered 2 words. Stupidly cute. With that, Melvin backed away, moving naturally as he took the mouse, beginning to study the stock trends. Carter stared at Melvin incredulously. Ever since he started middle school, no one had ever called him cute. And even if his grades weren't the cream of the crop, he had steadily remained in the above-average band. Nobody had ever called him stupid to his face. He even had a moment of doubt. Was it really possible that he was mentally deficient? Impossible. Melvin was clearly the abnormal one here. Carter got up, the veins on his temple bulging as he peered down at Melvin. What is it? Melvin asked. I'm going to find the warden. Carter seriously couldn't get it. He didn't owe Melvin anything. Why did he have to waste his time reading books for him? Melvin should have understood the look in Carter's eyes. He let go of the mouse, casually resting his hands on his thighs, telling Carter, Go ahead then. Make way. There was only one exit from this fan-shaped work area, which was on Melvin's side. If Melvin didn't give way, then Carter had to step over him. I'm not stopping you, Melvin drawled. But it was clear from his posture that he had no intention to move. Carter refused to squander time on something like this. He only hesitated for a moment before lifting his leg and stepping across Melvin's body. Carter moved very naturally, just as if he was stepping over a railing. However, right as his foot landed, a problem popped into his head. He couldn't let Melvin use the computer unsupervised and had to put it on hibernate. At the thought of this, he turned over and pressed the power button on the keyboard. Due to his ill-distributed center of gravity and awkward posture, after Carter hit the button and was about to straighten back up, his body involuntarily swayed. Swear to God, he was sure that he was completely capable of regaining his balance on his own. But Melvin just had to raise a hand and support his waist, which conversely disturbed his balance, and by the time he came back to his senses, he was already sitting smack on Melvin's lap, legs spread apart. There was something messed up about this position. Carter had a bad habit of analyzing people, which stemmed from his inability to rein in his imagination. It was somewhat similar to misophobia. People with misophobia might not necessarily want to wash their hands anymore, but due to their psychological condition, would still involuntarily reach for the tap. Carter was just like that. In such a situation, all he wanted to do now was to empty his brain, yet various indescribable images surfaced in his brain like a comic strip. He had even stripped off Melvin's shirt in his imagination. He bit his tongue, driving the racy filth inappropriate to the occasion out of his mind. But just as he was thinking of getting up from Melvin, he suddenly heard footsteps at the door of the library. Carter followed the sound and looked over, then saw Luke standing there gobsmacked. The two of you. That did it. Right now, Carter was sorely tempted to ram himself headlong into a wall and greet death. Don't misunderstand. Carter hurriedly got up from Melvin's body. It's not what you think. Really? Luke's line of sight shifted downwards, resting on Carter's waist. It was only at this time that Carter realized that Melvin's hand was still holding onto the small of his back. Let go. Carter slapped Melvin's arm away, whilst Melvin put on a blameless expression, as if saying that it was clearly Carter who had sat on him. What are you looking for me for? Carter walked to the library door, asking Luke. Just came to chat. Luke's expression still looked complicated. Don't worry, I can understand that you're interested in his type, but can't you at least close the door? Carter's head throbbed. How many times do I have to say it? Nothing is going on between us. No wonder Frank said that you weren't interested in him. He is lacking a little spice, Luke mused. But at the end of the day, Melvin is still a con. Is this really all right? First of all, what you saw just now was a misunderstanding. There's really nothing between us, Carter stressed. Secondly, so what if he's in con? Isn't your Gavin one too? How's that the same? Luke said. He's not a bad kid by nature. Then what made you decide that Melvin is bad? Luke shot him another weird look. Suddenly realizing that he was only making things worse the more he spoke, Carter dropped the topic, waving a hand at Luke and walking to the staircase. I have some business with the warden. We'll talk later. When Carter arrived at the warden's office, the warden was looking intently at the computer screen, seemingly reluctant to tear his eyes away for even a second. He swiftly glanced up at Carter, then back down again at his computer screen, saying, "Little James, my stocks have been doing quite well lately." He was looking at his stocks. Carter couldn't help but find it strange. Why would the warden chat with him about stocks for no rhyme or reason? And then he heard the warden speak again. "Melvin called me on the intercom just now and told me that you wanted to stop reading to him." The library's office desk had a telephone which Melvin would normally use to give the warden suggestions on which stocks to trade. Carter never expected that Melvin would seize the initiative before him. Despite the bad feeling that he was getting in his heart, he still raised his objections. "Yes, I don't want to get too close to an inmate. Our prison should naturally support an inmate if he shows a willingness to learn. How about this? You can just find someone to replace you," the warden said. Hearing this, Carter secretly let out a sigh of relief. By right, Melvin should be under the charge of the Block C supervisor. When it came down to it, he could just toss him back to the supervisor. However, the warden's words suddenly took a turn. The person you find must receive Melvin's approval. After all, he's the one being read to. He shouldn't have bothered. Poker-faced, Carter returned to the library. Melvin seemed to have already expected the outcome, his voice tinged with regret as he said, "It's already 2:30, Officer James." While half an hour wasn't a short time, it wasn't long either. The two of them had only talked a bit before Carter went out. Just like that, the afternoon reading time blinked past them. Melvin stood up, saying to Carter, "See you tomorrow, Officer James." With that, he left the library, following behind the prison guard who was outside the door. Carter sat back on his office chair. The library was restored to its usual quietness, and with it his frustration ebbed away. However, right then, Carter suddenly glimpsed the mouse on his table. Carter was very sensitive to the placement of items in his work area. He clearly remembered that before he left, the position of the mouse was different from it was now. It should be a little closer to the side where he was sitting. He hit the enter key. The computer was still locked. Logically, no one should have been able to use a password-locked computer. However, he definitely hadn't misremembered the placement of his mouse, which also meant to say that just now, after Carter left, Melvin had touched his computer. From the time that Carter started working here, the library computer had come with a default password, 1234. Normally, no one would come into his work area, let alone use this computer, so Carter hadn't bothered to change the password. In retrospect, this was probably a mistake. 1234 was a password so simple that as long as Melvin had been paying the slightest attention, he could easily guess it from Carter's hand motions. Carter clicked into the 7 subfolders one after another. Only after he was certain that the icon of the monitoring software was still hidden and couldn't be discovered did he exhale in relief. Previously, as a precautionary measure, Carter had hidden the monitoring software. He believed that even had Melvin actually used his computer while he was away, he would never be able to find where the software was hidden. He opened the web browser. There weren't any new browsing history records. Could Melvin have touched his mouse by accident? Impossible. Based on their interactions the past few days, Carter was much more inclined to believe that Melvin had used his computer and that he had surely deleted his browsing history. But then again, what could Melvin be doing online? There weren't any social media apps on his computer. The only thing he could do was surf the web. A vast majority of people used the web to search for information. If it was the financial news that Melvin was getting every day, why would he have to hide it? Carter swiftly thought of another possibility, one wherein he'd definitely delete his browsing history after looking at it. Pornographic websites. Like hell. Carter's thoughts ran rampant for the better part of the day, but he was unable to figure it out in the end. Even when delivering letters at the cell blocks the next day, his mind was still fixated on what Melvin could be using his computer for. Block C was the closest to the admin block, and Melvin's cell was right at the start of the corridor. Every time Carter went from the admin block to Block C, he would always pass Melvin's cell first. But today was strange, for during the early morning cell chores, unexpectedly, Melvin wasn't in his cell. 1017. He's been transferred to Block B, the Block C supervisor told Carter. So soon? Carter asked. First-timers in prison would spend at least a month in the newbie zone, possibly even longer, before being transferred to the regular cells. However, it was less than 2 weeks since Melvin entered prison. By right, he shouldn't be transferred so soon. Because Old 9 is back, the block supervisor kept his voice down, saying, those fellas in 1017's cell objected to sharing a cell with him, probably influenced by Old 9. Most fresh inmates would try to keep their heads down to avoid trouble. If Old 9 gave word for these people to ostracize Melvin, then no matter which cell in Block C he was placed in, inmates would protest. Isn't it dangerous to transfer him to Block B? Carter frowned, asking. Although Old 9 was in the neighboring Block A, Block B was a hodgepodge of all sorts. Among them was no lack of Old 9's lackeys. Those over there will keep an eye out, the block supervisor said. They've already assigned him to the safest cell. Carter inadvertently sped up his pace as he delivered the mail, not even bothering to exchange pleasantries with the inmates who greeted him. After making his rounds across Block B, he finally found Melvin in one of the corner cells on the ground floor. The 5 inmates sharing the cell with him were all pretty decent. Only one, named Ali, was associated with Old 9. Carter had seen them playing cards in the recreation room before. But as long as it wasn't 4 or 5 of them ganging up on one person, if it was only Ali, Carter believed that Melvin could handle it himself. He softly exhaled in relief, exchanged a glance with Melvin in the cell, then resumed his usual pace, going on to deliver the rest of the mail. At 9 o'clock, Melvin punctually came to the door of the library. On this side, Carter had just come back up from the mailroom on the ground floor. He fished out the key to unlock the library, casually asking, "Got used to it yet?" "It isn't too bad." Melvin followed step in step with Carter. "Thank you for your concern, Officer James." Carter indifferently glanced at Melvin, wanting to say that he wasn't concerned about him, but he couldn't be bothered to open his mouth in the end, walking straight into his work area. When Carter entered the password this time, he purposefully moved the keyboard to the side, keying in a crazy complex string of characters, so complex that he almost couldn't remember it himself. He didn't evade Melvin's scrutiny precisely because he was adamant to let Melvin know that he had changed his password. Based on what he expected, Melvin would certainly now be reflecting on where he had exposed himself, and thus be seated on the edge of his seat. However, what he didn't expect was for Melvin to broach the topic by his own volition, asking, "Did you change your password, Officer James?" "You have the nerve to ask this?" Carter said meaningfully, "Of course, just in case anyone touches my computer." Carter had already put it so bluntly that he felt no matter what, Melvin ought to be feeling guilty by now. But what did end up happening was that Melvin not only didn't show much reaction, he'd even nodded approvingly, saying, "That's probably for the best. The previous password is a little low-level." Breaking down the conversation between the two, it could roughly be condensed into this. "Carter, I know you touched my computer. Melvin, your low-level password was asking for it." Carter turned his head towards the windows, closing his eyes and slowly breathing out, calming the pent-up frustration. Melvin was basically admitting that he had touched Carter's computer. But not believing that Carter could do anything to him, he didn't feel the slightest smidge of guilt. The feeling came back again. Melvin was wagging his bushy tail, unperturbed, yet never letting Carter catch hold of it. "Officer James," Melvin bumped his knee against Carter. "It's about time for the central bank to release the stats." Carter finally found a chance to reclaim his lost ground, irritably saying, "Read it yourself." "You know I can't," Melvin said. "Are you upset at me?" Carter didn't answer. Okay, Melvin said helplessly, then I can only force myself to read it. Melvin opened the web pages, staring at a few lines of words for an age but never scrolling down. Even though Carter was holding a newspaper, his gaze was fixated on the computer screen. Not long later, Melvin suddenly turned his head over, and Carter hurriedly shifted his gaze back to the newspaper. Officer James, of these two rows, which is the consumer price index? Melvin asked. Unmoved, Carter read the newspaper, treating Melvin's question as air. They held at a stalemate for a while. In the end, Melvin exhaled, softening his tone. Don't be upset, Officer James. I apologize. All right. He didn't expect that this bushy-tailed wolf would actually know how to show him his belly. Carter must admit he did feel a tiny bit vindicated in his heart. Where? Carter set down the newspaper, putting on airs. These few lines, Melvin motioned with a lift of his chin. Read them all to me. During the time that Melvin looked at the stock market, the two of them were essentially able to be at peace with each other. Carter continued to read strawberry planting techniques while Melvin considered the stock trends, hardly saying a word. Someone once said that men were the sexiest when they were focusing on their work. Though Melvin studying stocks in prison couldn't be considered work, the way he looked when deep in thought was very attractive. Whether it was boxing or quietly analyzing, as long as he focused his attention, he would always give people a different feeling. It soon reached 9:30. Before Melvin left, out of the blue, surprising even himself, Carter called hold of him. He said, "Do you know that old 9 is back from the hospital?" Melvin stopped in his tracks. He turned his head back to Carter, saying, "Yeah, I know." "Watch out for Ali," Carter warned him. "He runs with old 9. Melvin lowered his eyes, falling silent for a moment before looking back at Carter. He asked, "What is he in for?" Carter said, "Rape." Pensive. Melvin nodded, then left the library. While Carter didn't dare to claim that he had a firm understanding of Melvin, his intuition told him that Melvin asking about Ali's crime was by no means a casual question. Vague unease stirred in his heart, but just then, someone suddenly howled from the opposite infirmary. "It seriously hurts, Dr. Luo." Carter came to the door of the infirmary, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at Gavin, seated on a single-size hospital bed, and said, "How did you get beaten up right after coming in?" Gavin had obvious bruises decorating the corners of his lips. Luke was frowning as he applied the medication on him. The others in his cell felt that he was too noisy. Luke's expression was dark, but his hands were still moving very gently. Carter couldn't help but feel amused. "Can't you quiet him down for a moment?" "No, you don't understand. The god of Go has appeared again." Gavin dodged from the cotton swab Luke held, chattering incessantly to Carter. "The god of Go disappeared for a super long time, but he finally appeared again on the forums yesterday." Uncomprehending, Carter turned to Luke. "Who's the god of Go?" Luke pressed down on Gavin, stopping his restless motions, then replied to Carter, "He's some great god on that damn forum." "What do you mean by that damn forum?" Gavin said discontentedly. "That's the most famous stock trading forum ever, got it?" Hearing this, Carter immediately latched onto a loophole, arching his brows and asking Luke, "You let him use your computer yesterday?" "Ahem." Luke awkwardly cleared his throat. "I was there to watch him to make sure that he wasn't up to anything bad." There was also a computer in the infirmary. Naturally, inmates weren't allowed to use it, let alone that Gavin was a hacker. Neither did Carter expect that Luke would actually be this loose with the kid. "That's not the point. Do you guys seriously not know who the god of Go is?" Gavin asked. Carter seriously didn't. After all, he didn't do stocks. According to Gavin, the god of Go was a legendary figure on the stock trading forums who had once predicted a major market crash several years ago. He analyzed the stock market every week on the forum and gave advice to retail investors, accumulating a large horde of loyal followers. But slightly over a month ago, the god of Go abruptly vanished. Many people were worried about his safety until yesterday, when he reappeared on the forums, briefly discussing a few stocks on the rise. What's so legendary about that? Isn't he just a sham god? Carter had never believed in those so-called stir-frying stock specialists. All they did was spout nonsense to swindle poor leaks. You're not allowed to speak of my idol like this. Gavin's face was austere. He said, several trashy listed companies were screwing the stockholders' money, but the god of Go exposed the truth, allowing retail investors to stop their losses in time. Carter found it weird. You do stocks too? Duh, you can only take down capitalists with capitalist tactics, Gavin proclaimed righteously. The god of Go is our leader. This kid just likes to hero worship some random idol. Luke put away the first aid kit with a headache. How can there be that many heroes in the world? Indeed, if it was so easy to become a hero, then the streets would be filled with them. God of Go, huh? Carter thought to himself idly, what an uncreative name.